The wagon was packed before dawn, not because the family was in a hurry, exactly, but because the day ahead was going to be long. The miles were not going to cover themselves, and the window of good traveling weather, the brief period between the spring mud drying out and the summer heat becoming dangerous, was already shortening with every morning that started late. The family loading that wagon in 1850 had made a decision that is almost impossible to fully understand from the comfort of the world that their decision helped build. They were leaving everything: the house, the graves of the people they had buried, the neighbors whose names they knew and whose rhythms of life had been woven into their own for years or decades. They were leaving a place where they knew what to expect. They were going somewhere that most of them had never seen, following maps that were frequently inaccurate, heading toward land that might or might not be as available and as fertile as the report suggested. With a wagon loaded with whatever they could fit and a journey ahead of them that might take 5 or 6 months through terrain that ranged from the plains of the Midwest to the mountains of the West to the deserts of the Southwest, depending on which route they chose and which disasters they encountered along the way. This was the American pioneer migration. From roughly 1840 to 1890, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people made the overland journey to the Pacific coast or to the territories that would become the western states of the American nation. They went along the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail. They went in wagons pulled by oxen or mules, moving at roughly 15 miles per day when the conditions were good and considerably less when they were not. And in those wagons, along those trails, in the homestead cabins they eventually built at the end of their journeys or along the way, in those spaces, families lived, with the same biological necessities that every human community in every era has had to address: sleep, hygiene, food, managing all of them within constraints that would, by modern standards, be simply described as impossible. Let's start with the wagon itself, because the wagon was not just the vehicle of the journey. For the duration of the trail, which could last 5 or 6 months, it was the home. A standard prairie schooner, the covered wagon that carried pioneer families westward, had a wagon bed approximately 4 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet long. That is roughly the same floor area as a large bathroom. In that space traveled a family and everything they owned and everything they needed for 5 months. The bed held food stores, cooking equipment, tools, spare parts for the wagon, seeds for the farm of the destination, clothing, bedding, and whatever personal possessions had survived the ruthless calculations of weight and space that governed what could be brought and what had to be left behind. Weight was the critical constraint. The oxen pulling the wagon could manage approximately 2,000 pounds of load over extended distance. When terrain became challenging, when the trail ascended into mountain passes, even 2,000 pounds was often too much. The historical record of the Oregon Trail is full of accounts of possessions abandoned at the base of difficult ascents. Furniture, trunks of clothing, iron stoves, books. The things that had seemed essential in Missouri became impossible weight in the Rockies, and the choice was the objects or the animals, and the animals were the only way home or forward. Sleeping in the wagon bed was possible, but rare for the adults of the family. The space was primarily occupied by supplies, and the organization of supplies for efficient access throughout a 5-month journey did not leave comfortable sleeping space for more than small children. Most adults, most nights, slept on the ground beside the wagon. A bedroll, blankets laid on a ground cloth, was spread on whatever the terrain offered, which was often not flat, often rocky, often damp. The ground of the overland trail varied with the geography. On the plains, the ground was typically firm and could be dry for weeks at a time. In the mountain sections, the ground could be wet, cold, and rocky. At river crossings, which the trail encountered dozens of times, the ground near water was soft and potentially muddy. The choice of sleeping spot each night was a decision that the trail boss of a wagon company or the head of an individual family made with whatever information the day's travel had provided about what the next few hours of rest might look like. Tents were brought by some families and could be erected on clear nights in sheltered locations. But tent setup added time to the end of an already long day, and tent takedown added time to the start of the next morning. and most families found that the blanket roll on the ground served the purpose adequately for the majority of nights. The night air on the plains and in the mountain sections of the trail could be cold even in summer. The elevation of the mountain passes made them chilly at night regardless of the season, and families that had come from the warm summers of the Mississippi Valley found that the western nights required more bedding than they had anticipated. The standard advice to overland immigrants included bringing more blankets than seemed necessary. The question of who slept where in a wagon company was organized partly by family group and partly by the social dynamics of the traveling community. Wagon companies, groups of families that traveled together for mutual aid and safety, typically arranged their wagons in a circle at night, creating an enclosure that served both as a corral for the oxen and mules and as a defined perimeter for the camp. Within that circle, families arranged their sleeping spaces with whatever privacy the circle's interior permitted, which was not much. The wagon company was a community of sustained and inescapable proximity, in the same way that the submarine and the cattle drive were, without the option of retreat into separate private spaces. What made the pioneer situation distinct from those other extreme environments was the presence of families. Not men without women, not crews without children, families. With infants and toddlers who needed to be kept alive through conditions that were hard enough for healthy adults. With elderly members who had come because the family was going and they could not be left. With pregnant women who were giving birth on the trail, in wagons, with whatever assistance the other women of the company could provide. The historical record of pioneer childbirth on the trail is one of the more remarkable aspects of the journey. Women gave birth in wagon beds, in the open, in temporary structures built from wagon bows and canvas. The labor was attended by the other women of the company. The newborn child might be one day old when the wagon moved again, because the company could not wait and the family could not be left. Infants born on the Oregon Trail were sometimes given the middle names of landmarks they had passed near the time of their birth. Now let's talk about washing, because personal hygiene on the Overland Trail was managed by people who were crossing a continent with the water they could find along the way. Water on the trail was not uniformly available. The trail was routed to follow water sources, rivers and streams that provided drinking water for both the families and the animals. But the quality of that water varied enormously. The water of the Platte River, which the Oregon Trail followed for much of its Nebraska section, was infamous among immigrants for its turbidity, heavy with silt and sediment that settled out only slowly and that produced a drink that tasted of the prairie. The water of many trailside sources was contaminated with alkali, natural mineral salts that made it unsuitable for drinking and caused illness in animals that consumed it in quantity. Identifying good water from bad was a continuous practical concern of the journey. Washing at reliable water sources was a regular activity, but the nature of that washing reflected the constraints of the journey. The standard was the same partial washing that appears throughout this series: face, hands, and the most functionally necessary surfaces attended to with a basin of water. The rest waited for a better opportunity. Full immersion bathing happened at some major river crossings and at established campsites near reliable water, particularly at Fort Laramie and Fort Hall, which serve as resupply and rest points along the trail. The women of the wagon companies treated major water stops as opportunities for full laundry, washing the accumulated clothing of the family in the river or stream, laying it on rocks or bushes or the wagon sides to dry in the sun and wind, and repacking the clean clothing for the next stretch of the journey. This laundry effort could occupy an entire rest day, and the rest days at major water sources were anticipated partly because they offered the opportunity to get the camp laundry done. The soap carried on the trail was typically homemade lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat before departure, carried in solid bars that survived the journey better than commercially produced soaps. The chemistry of lye soap was well understood by the women who made it, and the process of soap making was a standard domestic skill of the period that almost every farm wife brought to the journey. The soap that cleaned the trail laundry was often the soap that had been made specifically for the journey, produced in the months before departure as part of the systematic preparation of supplies. Hair management on the trail was simplified by the circumstances. Women typically wore their hair in practical arrangements: braids, buns, covered by bonnets, that minimized the time and resources required for maintenance. The sunbonnet that defines the visual image of the pioneer woman was not a fashion statement. It was a functional response to exposure to direct sunlight for 12 or more hours a day, every day, for months. Sunburn and sun damage were genuine health concerns for people walking beside wagons in open prairie sun. Men's hair was managed less systematically. Frontier haircuts, when they occurred, typically happened at established camps with access to someone with a pair of scissors or shears. Between haircuts, hair grew. The appearance of the average male immigrant at the end of a 5-month overland journey was significantly different from his appearance at the departure point, and the first stops after arrival typically included a barber. Now let's talk about food, because the feeding of a family for 5 or 6 months on the overland trail from a supply of food that had to be loaded into the wagon before departure and supplemented along the way with whatever hunting and foraging could provide was one of the most serious practical challenges of the journey. The recommended supply list for an overland immigrant family circulated in the guidebooks and newspapers of the period. The figures varied by source but converged on a general framework. For one adult, for 1 month, 200 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of hardtack, 75 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of rice, 5 pounds of coffee, 2 pounds of tea, 25 pounds of sugar, half a bushel of dried beans, 1 pound of saleratus, baking soda, 10 pounds of salt, a half bushel of dried fruit. Multiply these amounts by the size of the family and the expected duration of the journey to get a sense of the food weight in a standard immigrant wagon. The arithmetic was demanding. A family of 4 on a 5-month journey might carry nearly a ton of food alone. This was before cooking equipment, tools, clothing, seeds, and every other supply requirement was added to the load. The weight calculations that governed what could be brought were therefore extremely consequential for food as for everything else. The staple cooking of the trail was performed under conditions that required both skill and flexibility. The campfire was the cooking technology. Fires built from wood, where wood was available, and from buffalo chips, the dried dung of the bison herds that still covered the plains in the early years of the migration, where wood was not. Buffalo chips produced a serviceable cooking fire, burned hot and relatively cleanly, and were abundant enough on the plains that they solved the fuel problem of a territory where trees were scarce. The women who cooked over buffalo chip fires and learned to manage them as efficiently as wood fires were applying a practical adaptability that the trail required of everyone. The Dutch oven was the primary cooking implement. Cast iron, heavy, and indestructible, the Dutch oven could be buried in coals to bake bread, suspended over the fire to boil beans or stew, or used directly on the fire to fry meat. The woman who could produce a recognizable meal from trail supplies over an improvised fire at the end of a 12-hour walking day had a skill that was valued on the trail as a genuinely operational competence, not as a domestic nicety. Bread was baked on the trail using 2 methods. Where sourdough starter had been brought from home or obtained from another immigrant, it provided leavening for a bread that could be baked in the Dutch oven. Where baking soda and some form of acid, cream of tartar or vinegar, were available, quick bread could be produced. The bread of the trail was not the bread of a settled kitchen, but it was bread, and it was hot. And in the context of an exhausting day of travel, it was one of the most valued products of the campfire. Fresh food was the perpetual problem. The diet of the overland trail was like the diet of the mining camps and the cattle drive, heavily weighted toward preserved and shelf-stable ingredients. The fresh vegetables that existed at the departure point in Missouri were gone within the first weeks. After that, the diet was salt pork, beans, flour products, coffee, and whatever supplemented them. The supplements were significant and culturally interesting. Hunting was a constant activity on the trail, particularly in the early years of the migration when the bison herds of the plains were still intact. The plains bison provided not just meat, but a remarkable range of other resources that the immigrants learned to use from the indigenous peoples whose land they were crossing. Buffalo tongue was considered a delicacy. Buffalo hump roast was celebrated in trail accounts as one of the best meals the journey offered. The liver, the marrow of the bones, the fat. These were used by immigrants who were learning to process the animal as thoroughly as the plains peoples who had sustained themselves on it for generations. Wild game supplemented the diet throughout the journey. Antelope and deer were taken where available. Rabbits and prairie chickens provided smaller contributions, but more reliable ones. Fishing at river crossings produced trout and other species that briefly expanded the protein available to the camp. Wild edible plants, wild onions, berries, greens that the knowledgeable among the immigrants could identify, provided the fresh vegetable nutrients that the preserved food supply could not. The knowledge of what was edible and what was not in the territories the trail passed through was unevenly distributed among the immigrant companies. Some companies had members with direct knowledge of the Western territories, trappers, former mountain men, guides hired specifically for their knowledge of the route and its resources. Most did not. The guidebooks that circulated before departure provided some information about edible plants and reliable water sources. But the information was incomplete and sometimes incorrect, and the immigrants who relied on it too trustingly occasionally suffered the consequences. Cooking on the trail happened twice a day, morning and evening. The midday stop, if there was one, was typically a brief rest for the animals rather than a full meal preparation. The morning meal was started early, before sunrise in many accounts, and was simple: coffee, biscuits, or bread if there was time and fuel to make it, bacon, and whatever else came easily from the supplies. The evening meal was the more substantial preparation, cooked while the wagons were being organized for the night camp and eaten before the light failed. The division of labor on the trail was clearly gendered in ways that reflected the period and the culture. The women cooked, managed the camp, cared for the children, did the laundry, and managed the domestic supplies. The men drove the wagons, managed the animals, hunted, managed the mechanical condition of the wagons, and made decisions about the route and the daily pace. This division was not without exception. Women drove wagons when men were ill or injured, and men occasionally cooked, but it was the baseline organization that most companies maintained. The health of the immigrants on the overland trail was precarious throughout the journey and broke down completely during the epidemic years. Cholera was the great killer of the overland trail in the late 1840s and early 1850s. The cholera epidemics that swept through the immigrant trains following the major waves of migration in 1849, 1850, and 1852 killed thousands of people who had survived the departure, the plains, and the early hardships of the journey, only to fall to a disease spread by the contaminated water that the trail followed. The trail itself became a record of the cholera deaths. Graves appeared at the roadsides, simple graves, often marked with wooden boards that weather quickly destroyed, sometimes marked with stones. Immigrants who came behind found the graves of those who had preceded them and understood that the trail they were following was also, in its way, a corridor of death. The famous estimate is that there is approximately one grave for every 80 yards of the Oregon Trail. Thousands of people who did not complete the journey. Disease was not the only cause of death. Drowning at river crossings, wagon wheels slipping, animals panicking in the current, people in the water when the wagon rolled, accounted for a significant number. Accidents with firearms, which every immigrant carried and not every immigrant handled carefully, accounted for more. Falls from wagons, particularly among children who sometimes rode on the wagon tongue or played too near the wheels, were a documented source of tragedy. The physical danger of the journey was distributed through it with democratic impartiality. The experience of surviving the overland trail, of arriving at the destination, of reaching the Willamette Valley or California or Salt Lake, or wherever the journey had been aimed, was described by many immigrants as simultaneously the most difficult and the most significant experience of their lives. The people who emerged from the journey were, in the most literal sense, different from the people who had loaded the wagon in Missouri. They had done something that had changed them physically, psychologically, and socially in ways that the comfortable world they had left would not easily accommodate. The relationships formed in the wagon company were, for many immigrants, among the deepest of their lives. The proximity of the journey, the shared danger, the mutual dependence through months of difficulty. These produced bonds that lasted for the rest of their lives and that their children heard stories of for decades after. The wagon company was a community of the specific kind that extreme circumstances produce, one where individual self-interest and collective survival were so thoroughly aligned that the distinction between them nearly disappeared. And then they arrived, and they built homestead cabins of sod on the plains, of log in the mountains and forests, of adobe in the southwest. Small, dark, cold in winter, hot in summer. And there's the first shelter that was not a wagon or a tent or the open sky. The first four walls that belonged to the family rather than to the journey. From those cabins, from those first seasons of breaking new ground and planting and building, the West was made. Not by the mythology of the solitary frontiersman, but by families, by the particular human machine of people traveling together and building together, managing the biological necessities of life in conditions that were genuinely extreme, with skills and ingenuity and endurance that deserve more of our attention than the mythology typically provides. The wagon rolled west before dawn, and what they built with what they found is still visible in every western state. In the towns that grew from trail camps, in the farmland that replaced the prairie, in the water systems that made agriculture possible in the dry West, in the universities and the courts and the churches that the settlers built as soon as they had enough security to build anything beyond shelter and food. The story of the pioneer family is the story of ordinary people doing an extraordinary thing in an ordinary human way with the tools and the knowledge and the courage that were available to them. It is worth understanding exactly what that looked like. If this video gave you something worth knowing, please like it and share it with someone who would find it fascinating. Subscribe for more honest, detailed explorations of how people have actually lived throughout history. See you in the next one.